Hi, this is Quarantine Conversations number 8. I am here with Mr. Aron Ra. Hi, Mr. Ra. How are you?
It's all right. It's pronounced Aron, though.
Aron
Yeah.
Ra.
Yep.
All right. How are you?
Doing well, all things considered.
Okay. Yeah, with
Yeah.
the pandemic and all, absolutely. Well, Mr. Ra, I believe I saw you from afar in 2016 at the Reason Rally, and I meant to say hello, and I kind of lost track of you. But so we almost met once upon a time. Um, I noticed that you ran for office in Texas, so that was pretty cool. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Did you come close to winning or?
Oh, no, 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 no. There
Okay.
was there was never a chance I was going to come close to winning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often say that I was in politics just long enough to know that I don't want to be in politics.
Right.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was there's so much wrong with it. I mean, for one thing, when you're running against Republicans anymore, even it wasn't always the case, but anymore, you're running against children. You're going to be talking to fourth grade bullies, and that's the level of reasoning that they have. The guy that I was running against had in the previous election accused his fellow Republican in the primaries, his fellow Christian Dominionist Republican opponent. He accused him of witchcraft.
Wow.
Now, if he's
My
going to say
goodness.
that against another fundamentalist Christian, what are they going to say about me?
Right.
Yeah, can you
Wow.
just imagine how that would turn out?
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was another candidate that jumped in the ring who was really good
Hmm.
and really on the ball, and he was young, fresh, good-looking kid with a great attitude. I'm like, fuck, I would vote for this guy. So why the hell am I in here? So I
Yeah.
just bowed out and let him have it because in point of
Right.
fact, I didn't even want the job. I just wanted somebody has to run against the Republican. There can't just be uncontested Republicans every election cycle,
Yeah.
and that's what it had been for the last three election cycles. I mean, the only opponent that the Republicans had in my district was once a few cycles ago. They had a Libertarian, which is essentially the same thing.
Yeah. Whew. Okay. Well, Mr. Ra, we're going to be going through your foundational falsehoods, kind of based on your book, um, uh, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism.
Hmm.
Uh, Kind of hopefully maybe provide some education to some folks. The first thing I wanted to touch on is I once had a family member who's a creationist kind of come at me with this line of regarding radiometric dating. You know, we have all kinds of dating. We have ice cores, we have tree rings, we have carbon dating, we have potassium argon dating, we have
Rubidium, strontium,
yeah,
most commonly uranium, lead,
yeah, all kinds. And you know they all corroborate, and even speed of light from stars, all kinds of things.
and then
They
there's thermal luminescence and
yeah,
VARVs, and there's a whole lot. There are others that are not radiometric
right.
that also do, as you say, correlate. There's so many
But the
different
point is, yeah, they
means.
corroborate. Yeah,
Yeah.
they all tell the same story. But they were coming at me with this idea. What's the baseline? What's your baseline for the half-life decay or whatever? You know, and I never heard like I think it's kind of a non-question really. You know, they tell us that they have to be so old, right, based on their decay rate. So we know they're very old. But they came at me with this baseline thing. Have you heard that? Like,
No.
what's the baseline? Okay. I wanted to
So are
mention it.
they asking about the decay rate? I mean, I have no idea what they mean by baseline.
I kind of don't really either, but that's apparently one of their new talking points. And a family member came at me with it, and I kind of just said, I don't know what you mean, but we know through all these methods they're very old, and we have good estimates, and they all corroborate. So I didn't know if you've heard that before.
Well, this is my thought on the dating. I mean, you always hear about carbon dating whenever they're talking about fossils that
Right.
have been dated by other means to be in the millions of years old, because of course, carbon dating only is not accurate at all at or near 50,000 years. So, I mean, anything
Right.
that is that old, you're not going to get a reliable result out of it.
Hmm.
So, it likewise, how good is your telescope when you're looking at something microscopic?
Yeah.
So you have to use the right equipment for the right distance. And you can use a telescope to look at something microscopic, but you're not going to be able to get anything you're not going to be able to make sure of what you're looking at. So when we have something that gets into the millions of years, now we've got lots of different dating methods, lots of them that can all correlate and corroborate and as you back up each other and everything. So asking these people, this is a problem. They have a conclusion that they want to get to, and they don't care what the facts are in that. It's you can't get them to admit the fact exists. So they'll admit that carbon dating is unreliable past this age. Okay, we admit that too. We're not even using carbon dating.
Yeah.
But the dates that are provided by, in this case, rubidium strontium, and then they also used, this was to corroborate the date that had already been established by uranium lead. These are the two dates. Can you admit that the oldest, the range that we have is from here to here? These, they won't even admit that. Well, there's got to be a problem. These are unreliable. You can't even admit that that's the date, right? So when you run this date, and you say, you know what, I'm not sure if that uranium lead date is correct. Let's try a different method. Oh, look, it's in the same range. Rubidium strontium also says it's in the same range. You got any other methods? Sure, we can throw out a few of them. And in this case, we can use thermoluminescence. We can throw that one in too. Oh, look, it comes out to the same range. At what point are you going to admit, hey, this is the fact? Well, they can't, because they have to provide a story, because they've got their thinking so unbelievably backwards that they think that man created the hoax, right? You're going to believe man. Is rubidium strontium a man? Are the rocks that we're digging out of the earth, is the earth a man?
It's something I point out. I have a book called Justified Faith. It was published with Atheist Republic, and I point out, this creationist phrase, believe the word of God, not the word of man. And I'm like, what science reveals man didn't create that? Man did create the Bible, and he edited it and, changed it, altered it.
So man can't create all these fossils. Man can't create all the forgeries.
Unless it was a trick, by Satan. That's more plausible. Yeah.
So the entirety, I've met people who argue that the entirety of reality is a lie. Reality is a lie. The Bible is the only source of truth. Everything else is a lie.
And nothing will change your mind.
Because what is it man can do? Man can't create all these fossils. They can't create all of these forgeries and frauds and all of this. But what man can do is lie. Men can make up stories. And we know that men have made up not just the Bible, but a whole lot of other holy books, all professing to be the absolute truth and the revealed word of the one true God.
Yeah.
Right? It just depends. Are you looking at the Urantia book? Are you looking at the Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'u'llah? Are you looking at the Vedic scriptures, or the Bhagavad Gita, or the whole of the Mahabharata, or the Avestas of Zarathustra? There's lots of them. So we picked this Bible. We picked this storybook that was written by men. It is directly comparable in many respects to Aesop's fables. It's directly comparable to the Bhagavad Gita, which is many centuries older than the Bible. The Bible's not the oldest book. There's a whole lot of others that came before it, and the Bible is largely based on those other stories from Hellenism and
you mentioned Zoroastrianism.
Exactly,
had a lot of influence.
So men make shit up because they want to make things up, because they don't care what the truth is. And if you don't care what the truth is, then you're going to hold to that conclusion, and it does not matter what the facts are. You just won't let it matter what the facts. If you're ready to believe that the entire world is a lie, that everything in the universe is a lie, and that only the book of lies is true, then obviously you don't care what the truth is. The truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true, not whatever else we might want to pretend otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's what faith is all about. Faith is make-believe.
Yeah, and it's not a reliable
making
path
yourself
to truth
believe
either.
things that are not true.
Yeah, and it's not a reliable path to truth either, because it can take you to many contradictory places with no way to resolve them. Well, something like science has a way to resolve that, and it's based on evidence. Science is the real prophecy, because it's based on evidence. That's why it can predict things. So
yeah, at least to have those predictions come true.
I'm sure you've heard of the macro versus micro evolution, which really they're the same thing. But I have family members that, they say, oh yeah, evolution and bacteria, that's true. That microevolution is true, but macro, no, you never seen like a species come up from another species.
But the
So
very thing
that's
that
a
they just
common.
suggested, the very thing they just said that they admit in the bacteria, right? They're never talking about subspecies of bacteria. Those are always species of bacteria.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine was testifying to the Louisiana Senate, and he was trying to explain how evolution has been observed using, specific examples in bacteria.
Yeah.
And one of the senators say, "Did the bacteria turn into a human?" So that's how grossly distorted their understanding is. They don't want to understand what they don't want to believe. I've had
Yeah.
people admit to me that they believe what they know is not true, but they're going to believe it anyway. I had
Yeah.
somebody admit that to me in tears, that he's going to continue believing the lies. He doesn't care.
It's sad but true. Yeah. Well, Mr. Ra, getting into your book, the sixth foundational falsehood of creationism, evolution must explain the origin of life, the universe, and everything. What do you say to people that kind of had that perspective that, the origin of life had to be a miracle or evolution needs to explain it? Why can't it? We
They
have
can't
many
understand.
scientific theories, obviously, for the
Yeah, well,
origin of
the
life.
thing is that they're lumping all of science
Yeah.
against religion. So they don't know how to look at different, well, like the guys that came up with Big Bang cosmology
Yep.
did not believe in evolution. So if Fred Hoyle or Lemaitre or whoever comes up with Big Bang didn't agree with, understand, or accept evolution, then you can't say that Big Bang is evolution.
Right.
Likewise, nucleosynthetic theory, which is what Kent Hovind would call or chemical evolution, that was devised by Fred Hoyle, who hated evolution, and he
I've
also
read
came
that.
up with the name Big Bang as a means of ridiculing
As a
the Big
pejorative,
Bang.
yeah.
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 So Fred Hoyle would be aghast to see modern creationists so recently after his death lumping his theory and Big Bang, implying that he appreciated Big Bang and evolution at the same time. He would be rolling over in his grave if that were possible.
Yeah.
Right? So the guy that came up with abiogenesis, which is not spontaneous generation. I know if you open up a common dictionary written by Christians, they'll say that abiogenesis is spontaneous generation. It is not. They are completely different. They have no relationship to each other. Spontaneous generation was a supernatural belief in vitalism, that everything becomes alive because it's
Hmm.
infused with a mystical life force,
Oh yeah.
and that when you die, your mystical life force rots just as your body rots, and that this causes one form of life to turn into another form. So as you die, as you decompose, your life form becomes physical material in the form of mold or maggots or mice. Right?
Yeah.
That was a supernatural belief
Yeah.
that was disproved by a proponent of evolution. Now,
Yeah.
yeah, Louis Pasteur did not like Darwinian mechanisms because a lot of people didn't back then. They wanted to believe that they had some kind of mastery over their own destiny, and so he
Yeah.
embraced Lamarckism. A lot of people embraced Lamarckism back then,
Yeah.
but now we understand that this isn't a up matter of your own ambition,
Yeah.
right? That's transhumanism. That's going to another level.
Yeah.
But in most of it's just blind emergence.
Yeah. On a side note, there were a lot of theories of evolution going back a long way before Darwin. People had kind of an idea that things might be, working via evolution and not some kind of special, you know, super being created everything. You can find some of it like in ancient Greece. I forget the specific philosophers, but they had an kind of,
Anaximander.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, yeah. And in the Enlightenment, Diderot, he wrote a book called how you say his name, D.L. and Bear's Dream. It's kind of a little three-part fiction, and he has like evolutionary ideas in there. A lot of people don't know that. Also, his partner in crime, the Holbach, he wrote The System of Nature. It's kind of like the atheist Bible. It spread through Europe in the late 1700s, and it had evolutionary ideas in it.
I
Um,
haven't heard of that one.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah, I did a blog for Atheist Republic called Atheist Before Darwin, and I get into it. You can find a link on my channel. But yeah, and of course Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin uh, had kind of ideas of it. But really, Darwin found the mechanism. He collected the evidence that really got it going. But people had
Yeah, and
ideas of it before.
I'm glad that that the credit goes to Darwin and not to Wallace,
Oh yeah, he had
because
some crazy ideas. Yeah, yeah,
let's imagine for a moment that Darwin had a stroke before he found out about Wallace, and so Darwin died
yeah,
before he found out about, and so Wallace would get all the credit for this. Wallace's life story was vastly different than Darwin's, and the amount of
yeah,
research Darwin spent at least 10 years in intensive research after he gets home from the Beagle,
yeah,
after he finally devises his theory, then he comes up with 10 years of research to validate it, which Wallace never did.
yeah.
Wallace just had the light bulb come on in his head, and then he sent the manuscript to Darwin, and I'm glad he sent the manuscript to Darwin so that they could share the thing on that,
Right.
because you would just not you would have so many other ways of attacking the lack of research, that the lack of that 10 years to make sure that the theory was robustly supported. And then we would have had, because Darwin's argument was so strong because he'd done all that research, it was a pretty quick change when he came up with that book. So
Hmm.
Wallace would have published, it wouldn't have convinced very many people at all.
Yeah.
And so it would have been decades more before anybody figured out anything to go back and say, hey, you know what, this guy back 60, 70 years ago, I think he had a point. That's
Yeah.
the way that would have worked, I think.
And of course, Wallace believed in he believed in some kind of God, and he believed in spiritualism, I believe. Yeah. But Darwin, he could never come to call himself an atheist. So I believe in his autobiography, he wrote, he could call him an agnostic, essentially.
I I wish I could have been in their environment, to meet Darwin and Huxley, because I want
Yeah.
to meet the other atheists that they knew who must have sorely irritated them. And from my perspective, atheist, you're not convinced that an actual deity really exists. That's it. It's the yes or no question. Do you believe in a God? There is no third question. There is no, do you believe there is no God? That falls into a subset of those who do not believe there is a God, right?
All
So
right.
why are we even trying to throw in another question? There's no fence-sitting position on this. You're either convinced or you're not, right? And if you hold the
Yeah.
position that, well, maybe that's true and maybe it isn't, that's an atheist position. It's not a third category agnostic position. That's an atheist position. You don't believe,
Yeah.
right? The only things that are theists are the people who believe, and that's it.
Right.
But they want to change that definition because they want to own the playing field and make
Yeah.
rational thinking somehow seem exclusive.
Yep. Well, another foundational falsehood of creationism is there are no beneficial. I'm sorry. First, evolution is random. And of course, we know it's not random. Natural selection is not random. Mutation is random, but not natural selection. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we know, and every Christian will accept it. Well, they'll say, well, that's just microevolution, but that's kind of exactly the same thing that's going on at the macroevolutionary scale.
Yeah.
That when they will accept that natural selection works when we're talking about the thickness of a dog's coat or a bear's coat when it's in polar regions versus when it's in the tropics, and all. They'll understand how natural selection is deterministic in that
Right.
case. They don't recognize, they won't recognize, important distinction, they won't recognize how far it obviously goes. And
Yeah.
they don't accept and don't understand that natural selection doesn't always apply.
Yeah.
There's that natural selection was the mechanism that Darwin discovered, and remember, importantly, that he did not understand genetics.
Right. Yeah.
It was Mendel who came up with the first genes, and
Who
then
was
nobody.
religious? Mendel.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, but that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that like what would happen if Darwin had died and Wallace took over, right?
Yeah.
We had his work was published, but nobody recognized it for a hell of a long time.
Right.
And so with Mendel's work, Mendel's work was in obscurity until somebody else discovers genetics, and then it's been why. And this has got to be frustrating, as when they realize they've happened on this massive discovery, somebody says, "Wait, I read something just like that 10, 15 years ago. Here it is. Gregor Mendel already came up with the same idea. That had happened." So
Right.
somebody had to say, "Fuck." So I didn't discover it; he did.
Yeah. And Mendel and genetics is one of the vast number of pieces of evidence that have further corroborated, Darwin's idea in the 150 or so years since he came up with it, published it.
Yeah.
So everything is corroborated.
What I was getting to is that Darwin didn't understand genetics, so he tried to come up with this idea of gemules. That he knew that there had to be heritable units of information passed from the father and mother, but he didn't know how that was passed. And then he also had the idea that these traits were somehow blended, which we know that the traits aren't actually blended. The genetics indicate, dominant and recessive genes, so that it's not a blend at all. But Darwin had no idea about that. So the underlying mechanism that is constant, whether natural selection or sexual selection or social selection, whether any of these other selective processes are available or in application at all, we have genetic drift. That's always going. That never stops.
Yep. And one thing that even Darwin knew, and a lot of geologists knew, you have the fossil record. It's layered, and you have the most simplest life forms at the bottom. You have more complicated ones at the top. You don't have mixed, they're not mixed up. So that's a very, significant piece of evidence right there. I mean, the layered, the strata of fossils, how they're layered, and they have, you don't have humans at the bottom.
What you don't have in any of the fossil assortment is anything implying an intelligent designer.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments I'm working on right now, I'm actually working on another video addressing, whether birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments that this person makes is, birds have to be divinely designed because look how fantastic their respiratory system is. It's completely different than ours because they have all these air sacs and everything, which means that they are much, much better at processing oxygen out of the atmosphere. That gives them much, much more energy. And the guy won't admit that other dinosaurs had this too. Yeah. And the way other dinosaurs used it is when they were too big to fly, they did use that excess energy. So and this also enabled them to get enormously huge because they process oxygen so much more efficiently, so they're able to grow larger. But pound for pound, dinosaurs are far more advanced than mammals. So you have this huge cometary impact, and you have very few things that survive. You have things with long hibernation periods that survive. You have things that can go a month without eating that manage to survive, like crocodiles and things like that. You have the things that hide underground and hibernate. You have birds who can fly and eat a variety of just practically anything. So they managed. But the other dinosaurs were too specialized, had too high food consumption requirement because they are very high energy animals,
right?
Much more than we. And then our ancestors were omnivorous, small, and hibernating and buried. And so this is how we get past, and all the dinosaurs don't. But what that ends up with is that mammals, we're talking about ourselves as being the pinnacle of God's creation. Why do birds have a better respiratory system than we do? Why do we have to have a mammalian system? And why does every mammal have a mammalian system and every ave have a reptilian system?
Yeah, our great feature is obviously our brain, and that lets us kind of overcome a lot of our shortcomings through technology and our ability to communicate and all that. But our eyesight, even, octopuses, I believe, have much better eyesight than we do.
One of the arguments I'm going to be hitting on is that this guy wants to distinguish. I'm talking about this guy that was giving a presentation at Answers in Genesis, and he wants to distinguish birds from dinosaurs by showing how birds have exactly a dinosaur skeleton, slightly modified slightly refined to be a bird skeleton. You start with a dinosaur skeleton, and then you make a bird skeleton out of it. But would a creator be modifying his own previous designs? So this guy wants to say that birds have their legs coming out at the drumstick and that their thighs are somehow hidden in the body. It's complete bullshit because we know that that's not really the case, but that's what he said it was. If God is creating, then there wouldn't be this femur hidden inside the body that goes back to the pelvis. If God is creating, the legs would come out of the central position. That's how they would work.
Yeah.
That's the way a creator does. But evolution starts with the previous design and makes modifications to it.
Right. It can't start over
And the point is, that guy, and the point for this conversation is that guy who's given that speech knows that. It's all about make-believe. It's about making people believe so that they continue to pay the tithe. And not just so that they pay the tithe, but because more than just taking people's money and taking advantage of them, you also, if you declare yourself to be a representative of God, that means that you are somehow considered wise when you know fuck all about Jack, that you are considered moral when, you know, we've now seen just how reprehensible the clergy can be. And you're considered, you are granted political power, that you are a leader in the community. Why? Because you know fuck all and you're amoral as anything. But that's what happens when you present yourself as a religious leader. You're given power and prestige, even sex, as well as money and land, and just huge donations come your way. All you have to do is tell a lie that is a popular lie. You tell people that they are the reason that the universe exists, and that you're personal friends with the most powerful being in the galaxy, and then accuse everybody who doesn't believe that of being vain.
Yeah. And it goes to show you how unreliable belief in God is for determining truth. When you put on your God glasses, you can there's all these different sects that have come to all these different conclusions. And you can interpret anything if you have kind of your God glasses on as, fitting into your God scheme. Without it connecting to reality at all. And that's how you can have all these different sects that disagree on everything. It's just obviously so unreliable to getting the truth. All these different positions and all these people, a lot of them have the same God, theoretically.
When Ken Ham described the God glasses, he didn't realize that what he was describing already had a name. It's called confirmation bias.
Yeah.
It's a logical fallacy. It's where you refuse to admit anything that proves you wrong. You only look at the things that you think you can rationalize as showing that you're right.
Yep.
Because it's all about make-believe. That's the problem. Religion, science is about the truth. It has to be. The goal of science is to improve understanding. And in order to do that, you have to be able to figure out which is the right and wrong answer and which would be the more correct of the alteration. So your information has to be accurate. So accuracy and accountability are paramount. Faith has to be thrown right out the window, because faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have, and it is entirely auto-deceptive, leading to delusion. So we have to come up with whatever we can to eliminate bias or minimize bias, and faith has to be discarded right away. So we have to have other people, experts, test everything that we say. Have you noticed that when apologists when apologists argue with somebody, they'll argue about embryology, and I've seen this actually happen firsthand, where the guys are arguing embryology, and it turns out that the guy they're talking to is an embryologist. And then once they've realized that they're out of their depth, they're so, well, let's talk about geology then. Because they're going to change the subject to whatever that person doesn't know. But with science, you talk about whatever that person knows better than you. And when that person who knows better than you can't find anything wrong with what you're saying, not prove it right, but he can't prove it wrong. And so then it becomes a possibility. It's not that everything is possible to begin with, because everything is not possible. There's lots of things that are not possible. You have to show that there is a possibility to consider.
Yeah.
So religious thinking is absolutely backward. But the worst thing about it is it really comes down to fact versus fantasy, literally. So science wants to improve understanding. That science has to rely on truth. Religion has to declare truth, but is in fact nothing but a bunch of lies that has no truth in it.
Yeah, basically. Well, the next foundational falsehood: there are no beneficial mutations. Can you give us some examples? Beneficial mutations that.
I don't remember the names off the top of my head. My favorite one is a mutation in the LP. I can't remember the function of proteins in bones, so that you have either very brittle bones or you have super strong bones, depending on how this mutation can. The mutation takes
Right.
it from the norm and can go either way. Now, in some cases, there's some versions of this that have ghastly side effects, but there's been the one family in Pennsylvania that was identified as, I think it was Pennsylvania, that was identified as having this mutation without any side effects at all. The only thing that these people endure is that they have super strong, virtually unbreakable bones. That just that's it. How is that disadvantageous? I've
Right.
seen creationists try to find anything they could to say that there's a disadvantage there, including saying that their skeleton would be slightly heavier. Yeah, okay, slightly.
Right.
You make anything stronger and tougher, yeah, it's probably going to be heavier.
Yeah. One of the cool things they found is like lactose intolerance. Like humans not used to not be able to drink do lactose or anything at all, and now many of us can. I think another change they found recently is the size of skulls in humans has decreased. Um, I believe than the last
Yeah,
since modern humans have been around,
yeah.
which
It
is
seems that
odd.
Cro-Magnon
Yeah.
was the pinnacle of human brain size, which is
Yeah.
a shame because that was a time when there's no. Hold on a second.
Sure.
Yeah, that was a time when there's no written information. There's no way to
Yeah.
record your knowledge. You just know what you know, and other people only know what you can tell them.
Right.
Right. So you can only share so much of your wisdom while you live, and what you share is going to be diminished over time through many retellings. It's not going to be further enhanced until it's written down. Right. So it's
Yeah.
it's sad that it was the pinnacle of human intelligence before we ever figured out how to write anything.
Well, does size necessarily correlate with intelligence? Because I've heard that it doesn't necessarily. I believe Neanderthals had bigger
Yeah, it
brains,
doesn't
bigger skulls. So,
necessarily. It depends on the
yeah.
parts of the brain. And Neanderthals did have a statistically larger brain than we do, but the parts of their brain that were larger than us were the hindbrain, the occipital bun, which is more correlated with motor functions and such. So one would think that the Neanderthal kung fu was probably well better than any of ours, but
Right.
they didn't have the frontal lobes that we do. So the
Right.
types of communication they were evidently able to speak, but could they have had quite the empathy or compassion that we do because of these are all the other things that are in the frontal lobe? Perhaps not. It seems
Right.
that Neanderthals were very conservative socially. They
No.
did not like new things at all. So
We have
when
Neanderthal DNA, a lot of us, like a very small
very
percentage.
small, and
Yeah.
the studies that I've read indicate 120 admixture events over a 12,000 year period. So that ain't often.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it would imply then that whenever, and there's other archaeological evidence for this too, that when Cro-Magnons show up, Neanderthals leave.
Yeah.
And
But what do you think?
it's not necessarily that we're killing them, though that is possible.
Yeah.
It seems more likely that they just wanted to get away from us.
Yeah. What do you think about this theist argument that if we can't if our reason is based on evolution and determinism and atoms, all that, how can we trust our reason? I mentioned this briefly in a conversation I did with Lawrence Krauss recently, and he had a pretty good short explanation, but I just wonder what your I mean, I think obviously there's obvious evolutionary advantage to being able to accurately diagnose the world, because if you don't, you're going to die, right? And I think that smarter organisms are probably going to leave more offspring in a lot of situations. What would you say to that?
We're talking about people who readily change the topic of the conversation to where once I start to present evidence and they have no way of arguing against that evidence, then suddenly they have to say that the entirety of reality is an illusion. When people want to say that all of reality is a lie and only the lie is truth, how can they trust their reasoning? Obviously, if reality
Yep.
is real and we both agree on the onset, and I've done this with people, I get them to agree up front before, because I know they're going to say, well, you don't even know that you existed 2 weeks ago. How do you know that all your memories aren't falsely implanted, that we really live in a matrix? I get them to admit at the beginning of the conversation, is reality real? So if they admit that reality is real, and it doesn't matter any of these what ifs, you already agree that reality is real. And in that context, then we have these situations wherein my reasoning is going to outdo yours. And here's another way to look at it. If reality is real, then my evidence is therefore valid, because you can't argue against it if the reality is real. Then that means that your position is wrong. But if reality is not real, then that means the Bible isn't right either. Still, the Bible is wrong both ways. There is no version of reality where the Bible turns out to be true.
Well, of course, they say God gave us our reason and whatnot, and
which makes no damn sense. And it's an internally inconsistent argument, because God didn't give us reason. God prohibits us from using reason. We're supposed to believe what we're told to believe simply because we're told to believe it, and we're not allowed to put God to the test. We're not allowed to question that. We have to believe it, because if you don't believe it, that's apostasy, punishable by death. And if you question it, if you think maybe there's a different interpretation, or maybe it means something else, that's heresy, also punishable by death. Right. And the only reason that people would be punishing you to death is because it's a make-believe position. If there was any truth to it at all, if it was about truth, there wouldn't be any laws forcing people to believe one thing or another.
Yeah, very good point. No transitional species have ever been found. I mean, I'm thinking about Homo erectus and several others. I can't remember all the names. Habilis, Homo habilis.
Yeah, in my video on the ninth foundational falsehood of creationism, I showed just a brief cursory list of 400 transitional species that meet the strictest definition of that word. I'm not talking about, well, everything is transition from one thing to another. No, there's a much stricter definition, and there really are hundreds of them that have been positively identified. My favorite of all of those is probably Acanthostega, though there is, of course, Archaeopteryx is a great famous one, and Lucy is a great famous one, and both have been declared to be hoaxes, and neither one was. And we don't have just one fossil of each. We have several. I think we're up to 14 examples of Archaeopteryx, and somewhere around 300 of Australopithecus afarensis. So that's just one species out of a dozen of other similar species that are all transitional.
Yeah.
So but again, you're talking about people who do not want to understand, even if they know it's true, they want to believe something else, and they will admit that.
Yeah.
I got into it with this one Christian lady. I asked her, if you had a time machine and could, like a TARDIS, so you can go back and find Jesus, which I don't think is possible. Even if you spoke Aramaic, I don't think you'd be able to find Jesus with a time machine. But let's just say that you could. And you watch Jesus get crucified and die. And then you can just camp out in front of that tomb for a solid week. And Jesus's body rots and never gets up. This is what you see. Now, I don't believe that any of this would be what actually happens if you had a time machine. I don't think you can find Jesus. I don't think if you did, it wouldn't be the guy that you thought it was. Even if you found Jesus, Jesus wouldn't be the guy you thought he was, right? So there's so much wrong with this. But assuming, just hypothetically, that you see your character, you identify this guy as Jesus, this is Jesus enough, because I think there's more than one inspiration for the Jesus character, surely.
Right. Yeah.
But if you see this guy die and never be resurrected, I mean, what greater proof could you have? So hypothetically, would any amount of proof ever change your mind? Right? That was the question.
She said no.
And she said that even if she watched Jesus die and never get up again and his body rot, she said that she hopes that she could still believe even when her eyes tell her otherwise, which tells me it's all about the make-believe, not about the truth.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So macroevolution has never been observed. What do you say to that?
Not only will creationists accept microevolution, they will very often accept macroevolution, just not called macroevolution.
Oh, really?
Because In the earlier example, they said that they will accept new species of bacteria as long as they don't have to acknowledge that it is new species. They'll say the sentence, we've never seen one species come from another species. And in the next breath, they'll say that they accept speciation, but not macroevolution. The fuck is the difference?
Yeah.
Because the definition, which was invented by evolutionary biologists, by the way, so it's not that we're redefining this. This was always the definition. That microevolution is variation within species, like small-scale variation within species, within limited reproductive populations.
Right.
Macroevolution is variation between species at or above the species level. And this is generally considered the large scale because there's different dynamics involved when you get speciation, when you have a new species erupt out of the gene pool who no longer interbreed with the parent gene pool. Small isolated populations have much more variability than what happens with the larger the gene pool is, the more restrictive it is on new variety. But when you take any small group, small population, and isolate them, very, very quickly you will have new variations. So that if you were to take like two groups from a huge population where they're the same everywhere, take these two groups and put them in isolated positions, and then come back 25 generations later, where they've done that 25 times, they've had kids and the kids have had kids and so on.
Right.
And then you're in a middle position between those two isolated populations and you find a lone straggler from one of them. You would be able to identify, just in a couple of dozen generations, you would be able to identify the peculiarities that show which of those two populations that lone straggler came from. Because this was genetic drift that I was talking about before. It's constant. Right. These unique mutations are occurring all the time. And mutations are not the gigantic X-Men comics kind of mutations either. I mean, every human zygote has 128 mutations on average, right at the moment of conception. And then we accrue more as we age. It's the significant mutations that are relatively rare. But virtually every difference between us comes down to mutations.
One thing that I like to point out, I know it's not necessarily sound, but to get people to kind of get an idea of evolution, obviously tell them that, it occurs over vast time spans, that, but what I try to use is embryology. Look at this little cell, it became a person, it became an adult over time. And look at that, how there can be transformation like that. And I know people used to say, scientists, that's a recapitulation of the human evolution, and that's not necessarily accurate, but I think it's a good thing to point to get them to visualize, to see, to grasp. There can be transformations like that. That's how life operates. And I also tell them, look, fossils, we're lucky to have any. This is a continuous process, and we label them different names, species, but we're seeing like basically snapshots at a certain period of history. That's what we're seeing in the fossil record. So
at the Reason Rally 2012, there was a guy that tried to argue against evolution by telling me that he was never a glob of goo, and I said, so you're not a product of sexual interactions between your parents? How were you created then?
Yeah.
You should have seen the look on his face when he had to realize that he was in fact a glob of goo.
Wow. That is hilarious. Wow. Another thing, Mr. Ra, is we've never observed speciation. What do you say to that?
All the people that accept speciation, I mean, they will argue different kinds, and this is where the taxonomy becomes relevant to like every evolutionary argument for me. They want to say that there's a dog kind, and they're having a problem with wolves being not part of the dog kind. But then there's two different definitions for dog too. We commonly use dog in reference colloquially to domestic dogs that were derived from wolves, but taxonomically, dogs are canids, and it's a much broader category. And so they want to come up with kinds that the believers will come up with kinds that will distinguish certain groups from certain groups. So they'll lump together domestic dogs and wolves, and then they'll want to say that all of these canids are the same kind, except where they have to accept foxes. They'll recognize that foxes are not the same kind as dogs. It's only dogs are dogs, and dogs only produce dogs. And all dogs are chemically interfertile until you bring up the raccoon dog of Asia, or the bush dog of South America, or the African painted wild dog, the Cape dog, also known as Lacayon pictus, which is so
Right.
genetically distinct that it's not chemically interfertile with any other dog species. I mean, domestic dogs, wolves, none of those. Jackals, none of that. It is its own thing, just like the bush dog and the raccoon dog. And they can't accept that because they're trying to use evidence of evolution as if it was evidence against evolution. Ultimately, it comes down to some people who had no idea what they were talking about wrote a book of fables, and now you are trying to make believe the book of fables, even though we know there's no truth in it, and that should be enough, even before you find out how many lies are in it too.
Yeah, and dogs go back to artificial selection. A lot of dogs are because we made them that way. We control their breeding and all that. So
Yeah, and artificial selection, by the way, works completely opposite of natural selection. This is an important thing for people to realize. Natural selection works for the fitness of the animal, or for the organism in case of plants and such, whereas artificial selection is never to favor the animal. We may breed horses to run faster, because we want them to race, but for most things, what we breed for, like when we bred Pekingese, somebody had a mutant pup. There was a Chinese empress had a mutant puppy, and she thought that mutant puppy looked like the Chinese stylized impressions of a lion, and so she wanted to breed more that were like that, so to find that recessive mutation, and that's where we get the breed Pekingese.
right.
So we breed ducks that are big and fat, so they make good food, but also don't have enough wingspan, they're too heavy to fly. That's not to their benefit. Natural selection would never breed something to taste good to something else.
Right. And of course, natural selection operates at the level of the gene. Uh, so, you know, based on Richard Dawkins' work, at least that's a popular take on it.
Mhm.
So, Mr. Ra, evolution is a fraud. We know there's been like a Piltdown Man and some there's been some fraud, but who detected it? Scientists and
And who perpetuated it? Who prompted that fraud? Because that's another thing. They will
religious
point
people,
to
right?
they will point to Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel did not perpetuate any fraud.
Yeah.
And it wasn't evolution or evolutionists that perpetuated Piltdown Man. There were two primary suspects, and an accomplice, and all knew each other in close cahoots. They were neighbors, and one of them, I forget the name of the lawyer. He was into faking fossils. He'd made a number of fake fossils, and so he was just into money. That's all he cares about. He's not a scientist. He's a lawyer. So he adopts the practice of digging up his own fossils. So he paints himself as a paleontologist, but actually what he is just a fraud. He's finding his own fakes.
Yeah.
Then his neighbor, Arthur Conan Doyle, famously the inventor of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Arthur Conan Doyle had a motive against the Natural History Museum because he didn't like naturalism. Arthur Conan Doyle believed in fairies.
Spiritualist kind of.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And he hated naturalistic explanations. So it seems to me, and a
I
number of
heard he
other
was an
people,
atheist though.
he was an atheist in the respect that he didn't believe the Christian kind of mythology, but he believed in mythology. He still believed in supernatural shit. Now,
But not a
whether
god
gods,
necessarily.
I don't know whether any gods are included in his mythology or not,
Yeah.
but I know that he was into spiritualism. He literally believed in fairies. He bought the Cottingley fairy scam that was perpetuated by a couple of 11-year-old girls. He bought that scam. The inventor of
Right.
Sherlock Holmes bought that scam where these little girls drew pictures of fairies and cut them out and then prop them up on rocks and stuff so that they could take these trick photography where it looks like they're looking at or talking to fairies. And it was
Yeah.
brilliant done for the time. I mean, it is good artwork, and
What
it
a
was
massive piece of irony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he had a motive, and his motive was not to promote evolution against creationism. That fraud just never happened. He wanted to
Yeah.
shame naturalism. And then the accomplice was somebody that worked at the museum, who was a known associate, and also had the chemical agents in a trunk in his room that were used to fake these fossils. So apparently, three guys. My hypothesis, my personal hypothesis. Everybody looks at which of the three accomplices. I think they were all working together.
Interesting. Well, Mr. Ra, creation is evident. What do we say about that?
What
Creation.
creationist evidence?
No, your 14th foundational falsehood is creation is evident. That the creation.
Yeah, there's a
that.
claim that creationism
Right.
is evident, but there's no evidence. There's no fact that indicates that.
Yeah. I think science seems to show things are bottom up, like via evolution.
Yeah.
So
they want to believe that there's an administrator working from the top down, where evolution is.
Where do you come from? We can get into all those questions.
Yeah, and it's always from the bottom up. It's always that glob of goo.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Becoming what we are.
I think religion is kind of people anthropomorphizing the universe. I think people it's born of human fear and ignorance, basically. They saw kings and people making things, and they kind of projected that onto the universe.
And we're not getting any better, by the way. Our situation is actually getting worse, as far as how irrational we're becoming. And it's
not everybody, though. I think we need something in some area.
Yes, not everybody, just everybody who's in charge.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, in most places, anyway. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. That's your last foundational falsehood.
Yeah,
it's as much as a fact as something can be, right? Germ theory.
Yeah, every modern scientific theory is also a fact. So a theory is just an explanation of that fact. So atomic theory, it is a fact that the theory, atomic theory is the postulation that all matter is made up of atoms. Now, while that is a theory, that is also a fact. And the theory explains the fact, because it doesn't just include that one fact. It includes all of these other supportive facts, all the other evidence, and all of these other hypotheses, and even natural laws. Very often, laws are categorized beside theories, but theories actually do include laws. Mendelian genetics, for example, are inside the theory of evolution, or they're included by that. Von Baer's laws of embryology are included within the theory of evolution. So the theory of evolution is that life forms evolve, that populations evolve over time due to these subtle changes in our genetics and the different selective pressures. That's an established fact, and we've been using that fact throughout the history of agriculture. And we associate that theory with other theories like the cellular theory, that all life is built on the basis of cells, or the theory of the germ theory of disease, that diseases are caused by pathogens. Again, that is a fact. It's a body of information that includes other facts and hypotheses and all that, but that general thing, it's a fact. And then also, relativity has some problems to it, but generally relativity is more highly regarded than, although relativity has some problems, it's more highly regarded than gravity, which it replaced the theory of gravity. And the old theory of gravity is generally considered by believers to be a fact. It's a fact that was replaced by relativity, and relativity is now being replaced or refined further into something else.
Right. One thing about science is, religious people say, oh, science is always changing its mind, and science, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, science typically builds on what's come before. You know,
It's a game of
and
20 questions.
yeah, Newtonian mechanics still get us to the moon, even though we had the coming of relativity and quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
It still works in its domain.
What would happen
So
if you had a game of 20 questions where you had unlimited questions? So this is the way science works. So every new question you ask, you get that yes or no answer, right? So you're performing the experiments. And that's what the experiments are trying to establish, the yes or no answer.
right,
So with every question you ask, your information changes because it has improved. Every question causes an improvement, but an improvement is always a change.
yeah,
Whereas
yep,
religion changes also, and that's why we have 30,000 different denominations, or 40,000 now, of
yeah,
Christianity.
yeah.
And Christianity is just
I
one out
can't
of
even
thousands
believe
of
that number.
religions.
That number sounds crazy to me. I don't even know how that can be real.
Yeah, there's almost as many varieties of Christianity as there are Christians in the pews.
Yeah. Well, really, everyone has their own personal religion when you think about it. you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm personal friends. It's not that I know a personal friend of God. I am the personal friend of God. And
Yeah.
God tells me something different than he tells everybody else. So you get a handful of people who say what God tells them, and God tells them all something different. It's contradicting what he
He's
told
sending them
everybody.
different messages. So, like, what's going on there?
Yeah. So God told this guy it's okay to believe in evolution and told this other guy evolution is a lie. Why would God say these two contradictory things to these two different people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And people have never thought about a lot of these questions. They've never come across them, and that's
Yeah.
it. That's the common theme that I
But
found.
and they also don't look. Very often, most people, it seems, never look for these.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Ra, we were going to get into some biblical issues, but we're kind of going close to an hour now. So
Yeah.
perhaps we'll get that another time or
Okay.
something. But thank you so much for your time. You've been very gracious, and thank you for coming on my new channel here. I'm trying
No,
to grow.
appreciate it.
It's been a
All right.
very interesting conversation, and hopefully some people will see this video and learn something.
Yep.
Um,
I would suggest a large black or a large green screen going behind you.
yeah, yeah, we're gonna get that. Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well,
But
talk to you later,
again,
sir.
thank you, sir. Appreciate your time.